Could I ask everyone to be seated? Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everyone here to the American Foreign Service Association. My name is Ian Houston. I'm the Executive Director here at AFSA, and it's a real pleasure and honor to have Congressman Connolly with us here today. Thank you for being here, sir. And for all our guests here, we appreciate you being here as well. And it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Silverman, the President of AFSA, to start today's program. Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to AFSA headquarters. It is really a pleasure and a timely opportunity to welcome Congressman Gerry Connolly to AFSA. He is a true champion of the federal employees and the Foreign Service. And he is our friend, and representing Fairfax County, Tysons Corner, Reston, and the entire 11th District of Virginia. Before I ask Sharon Wayne, the AFSA Vice President for USAID, to introduce the Congressman, I have three thank yous. First, a big thank you to the great AFSA staff, and in particular, Advocacy Director Javier Cuevas and Legislative Director David Marimi for putting this event together. Thank you, team. Second, I would like to recognize Jim Meenan. Jim, raise your hand. He's here. There he is. For being a great AFSA volunteer and a constituent of Gerry's who loyally shows up at Gerry's St. Patrick's Day annual dig, and thank you. Gerry knows him well. Thank you for everything you do, Jim. Finally, a big thank you to the Congressman for all of your efforts in support of the federal employees in general and Foreign Service in particular. Let me just mention that thank you for leading the way in the very dark days of fall of 2013 during the federal government shutdown when you led the way to get us retroactive pay. Thank you. Thank you for co-sponsoring the Mustafa Akarsu Local Guard Support Act, a bipartisan bill that, if passed, will give all the families of Foreign Service nationals who lose their lives in the line of duty a special immigrant visa. Thank you for supporting that effort, Congressman. So we are very proud to call you our friend. Thank you. And now let me ask Sharon to come and formally introduce the Congressman.
Thank you for joining us today. It's indeed a great honor for AFSA to have with us here this afternoon Representative Gerry Connolly. Before I talk about his impressive public service career, I would like to share with you a little known fact. Over 800 of our fellow colleagues call the 11th Congressional District home. That is the largest concentration of Foreign Service members and their families in a single congressional district. Yay! Luckily for us, the people of the 11th Congressional District made an excellent choice. Congressional Connolly is serving his third term in the U.S. House of Representatives. His district encompasses Fairfax County, Prince William County, and the city of Fairfax in Northern Virginia. Congressman Connolly serves on the House Committee on Oversight and the Government Reform and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He is also co-chair of the Congressional Caucus of U.S.-Turkey Relations and Turkish Americans, co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Korea, and co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Taiwan. Prior to his election in Congress, Connolly was chairman of the Board of Supervisors in Fairfax County. The congressman received an MA in Public Administration from Harvard University in 1979 and a BA in Literature from Maryknoll College in Glen Ellen, Illinois. After graduating from Harvard, Congressman Connolly spent 10 years on the staff of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's not often that I get the opportunity to introduce anyone using that line that they wrote the book on anything. But with Congressman Connolly, we have with us today a deep friend and a co-drafter of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1980. The Congressman continues to care deeply of foreign assistance, and to this day, we'll hear about that shortly. Welcome, Congressman Gerry Connolly. Thank you.
afternoon to everyone. I'm Kristen Fernikes, and I'm the Director of Communications here at AFSA. And I, as a proud resident of Northern Virginia, am so delighted to have Congressman Connolly here with us today. We're lucky to have such a good friend. I'm going to get the ball rolling with just a few questions to the Congressman, and then, of course, we'll take some questions from all of you nice people. And we are lucky to have some questions that have come in from the field as well, so we'll intersperse those. We're very pleased to have gotten input from our colleagues who are out in the field doing the great work that we know that they're doing. Congressman, is your mic? Yes, great.
Hello, can you hear me?
There you go.
You all know St. Patrick's Day is coming up, right?
He did mention that that is the single most important thing here, so
Only a day.
we may talk about that extensively. So let me ask you, you have an incredible background and expertise in both foreign affairs and in the legislative process. So I wonder if just to start out, you could give me any sense of what your colleagues in Congress, what Congress has in mind from your perspective for the foreign affairs agencies.
Well, first of all, if I may, Kristen, thank you so much for having me here today, and thank to all of you for being here, and thank you for your service to your country. We often say that to the military, deservedly so, but we don't often say it enough to public servants, especially those who serve overseas. And you know, the tragedy in Benghazi is just that, a tragedy. But it is a reminder that when we take on those responsibilities, those are high-risk responsibilities. And it is it's an act of self-sacrifice to one's country to want to take those tasks. And I honor you all who have served in the Foreign Service for that. And I know most of my colleagues would certainly share that sentiment. What are we going to do legislatively? Well, hopefully, given this Congress, very little. You know that the rule doctors always take, first do no harm. We're trying to practice that a little bit in Congress. I worry that, honestly, that a lot of what could happen is not good. And so we're going to be spending a lot of time over the next 2 years fending off things that I think would be harmful, maybe, to both the Foreign Service and to our posture abroad. So where we can find common ground, hopefully we will. And there are areas where we will, I think, find some common ground. But I think, unfortunately, they're going to be few and far between. One of the most alarming things to me that has happened in President Obama's tenure is that we have made foreign policy a much more partisan topic in every respect. And even including who we invite to address the joint session of Congress. And that ought to bother everybody, irrespective of how you feel about Prime Minister Netanyahu or what your politics may be. So let me get this straight. Depending on who's in charge, who has a majority, we're going to pick our favorite foreign leader, especially if that foreign leader is in a position to embarrass the president of the other party. That's a very interesting development in foreign policy, and not one I welcome, and I wouldn't think, upon reflection, most of us would welcome.
You mentioned that you do think, though, that there are some potential opportunities. Anything specific?
Yes. Two areas I would say we have the potential for common ground. First is trade. The administration has a very significant pending agreement, not yet finalized, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It needs trade promotion authority to proceed with that. Every president, going back, I think, to Richard Nixon, has had TPA, and I don't see any reason why this president would be denied it. I think there is probably a working majority on the other side of the aisle, and a modest group of us on our side of the aisle who can find that common ground and would vote for that, and ultimately approve the TPP. I am a free trader, and, you know, assuming that the agreement meets minimum, you know, criteria that we care about, I would be kind of a supporter. That would be a minority point of view on my side of the aisle, unfortunately. But I do think we can have common ground there. The other one may be an authorization for the use of military force. The President has now acknowledged that we need to refresh the AUMF that's 13 years old, and I agree with him. And my colleague Tim Kaine, the senator from Virginia, has certainly staked out a very strong position in this. I share those views, and I think Congress has to step up to the plate. And if, you know, it's easy for people like McCain and Lindsey Graham to throw, you know, lob grenades at the president about what he should and shouldn't be doing all over the world. Well, you know what? Put your money where your mouth is. If you really think that's what we ought to be doing, then let's formally have an AUMF to authorize the president to respond to the threat that ISIS represents. So I think those two areas right away have real potential over the next 12 months to find some common ground. I don't predict we will, but I think there's a fighting chance we will.
And we'll try and remain hopeful on those fronts. So the president's budget, obviously, as we all know, recently out last week for fiscal year 2016. And is there anything that you can tell us about how that reflects the needs for battling the epidemic of Ebola and safety and security issues for U.S. personnel overseas? These are obviously things that are right in the forefront of the minds of many Foreign Service personnel.
One of the problems, well, let me take the second one first. You know, I find it ironic that some of my colleagues have been so outspoken about what they consider inadequate security arrangements in Benghazi, a high-risk place to begin with, when they have actually voted against a lot of investments to shore up our embassy security, consulate security abroad. That's a fact. You can look it up. They have a record. And I don't think you get to have it both ways. Obviously, we should be doing whatever we can to make sure that we minimize the security threat abroad. I think the President's budget attempts to do that. I would hope this time around Congress would be maybe more supportive and responsive in light of the tragedy in Benghazi. I'm old enough to remember, as are a number of people in this room, Ronald Reagan in Lebanon. And I went to Beirut, and I visited the MAU, the Marine Amphibious Unit at the Beirut airport. It was a Shia neighborhood. We had no Arab-speaking intelligence. We relied on the Shia neighborhood. And at that point, they were supportive of the U.S. presence. But when we shelled Suqal Garb, we suddenly were seen as an enemy of the Shia. And that neighborhood then turned on us, and we had no protection. And we lost 241 young men. We had our embassy blown up twice. I had a good friend who was killed, Bill McIntyre, in the first bombing. And I don't remember Democrats, you know, wanting to have all kinds of impaneled investigations against Ronald Reagan and his incompetence and putting American security at risk and deliberately covering up and hiding and on and on and on. We felt it was a tragedy. While there were clearly lessons that could have been learned, there were things that could have been avoided. Certainly putting our Marines in a Shia neighborhood with no protection was not something that you had to appreciate after the fact. We could all see it when we were there. But having said that, we came together as a country, and we didn't want to make a foreign policy tragedy a partisan issue. And it saddens me as somebody who remembers those days that unfortunately that tradition has fast eroded. It's not good for the country going forward. So anyway, I think the President's budget will take cognizance of and does take cognizance of the need for shored up security. And as I said, I really hope Congress will be supportive.
So on the front of pay, as it will, and expenditures and so on and so forth, you have, as Bob mentioned, consistently been a champion for federal employees. And, with pay freezes and something that you fought for with retroactive pay with the 2013 government shutdown, I think all federal employees very much appreciate that. You recently introduced legislation for a pay increase of 3.8%. Why would you say that federal employees are having such a hard time with this right now? What are federal employees up against?
This is going to sound partisan, and I wish it wouldn't. But in the run-up to the 2010 midterm election, now Speaker Boehner gave a speech, I believe in Cincinnati, in which he basically disparaged the federal workforce. It was bloated, it was overpaid, it was too big, it was unproductive, and it needed to be reined in. For the equivalent of your CEO to disparage your own workforce that way is very troubling to me. It's a far cry from John Kennedy ennobling public service and saying, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you, that was a call to public service. And hundreds of thousands of people answered that call. And all kinds of exciting things actually grew out of that call. And I want to see a return to the appreciation of the nobility of public service. And I will not be party to anything that diminishes or disparages that service. And I would hope that more of my colleagues, as they learn more about how the federal government in fact operates, including in their own districts, might come to that point of view as well.
Do you have a sense, though, of why that's an easy, the attack on federal service is an easy thing to sell?
I think it's very easy to, it's easy to create some demons. Ronald Reagan did it with, the welfare queen. And he loved giving that example of, she's driving around in a Cadillac and she's eating filet mignon, lobster tail, and it's all on your dime as a taxpayer. And doesn't that make you outraged? And of course it did. As if that characterized everybody in welfare. You'd never know from that story that the average person on welfare is a single mom who's on it for 18 to 20 months, uses it to get back on her feet and help her kids, and actually often goes on to an economic success story. It helps people, and the people who use it are overwhelmingly people in need. And so similarly, it's so easy to make the public employee a punching bag. Bureaucrats, pointy-headed bureaucrats who just make our lives more complicated because apparently they take perverse pleasure in doing it. That's really who they are. And it's them. And as opposed to, no, it's us. And the good narrative of all the services public employees provide to our constituents get drowned out. And the media is, it's a lot sexier to talk about some horrible bureaucrat who made life more difficult for somebody than to tell a success story of the dedicated. There was a story in today's Post, to show you an example. So a story, a true story about the abuse of a conference, a training program that took place in Las Vegas, is now having an impact on our ability to network, to train, to get professional credits. Every study done about innovation in the private sector anyhow tells you that it's the informal networking that actually is the most productive venue for creativity. Now, gosh, Matthew, I didn't know you were working on the same thing I'm working on. Maybe we could get together and collaborate. And all of a sudden, we invent the internet together. So think about the opportunity cost because we're overreacting to an abuse, as if that abuse characterizes what every federal conference, all of you are all about staying at fancy hotels that the average citizen can't stay at, pay for frivolous leadership exercises, drinking a lot of alcohol and fancy hors d'oeuvres, and by and large living high in the hog at taxpayer expense. That's really what these things are, and obviously we can do without most of it. And the Post today had a good story about the consequences of that. That, wait a minute, how about professional training and the value of, I mean, the other side of the story. And that bad example does not characterize the overwhelming majority of expenditures for conferences and conventions and training and so forth. So I just think it's very easy to demonize, and there's a lot of reward politically for it, but there's real damage. And if I could just say one other thing, I find it ironic that people who say, you know, I wish our government would just be run like a company, like a corporation. Now, I worked in the private sector for 20 years. Any CEO who said, we're going to freeze everybody's wages for 3 years, we're going to go in and we're going to root out and cut back on other benefits, we're going to disparage my workforce because they're lazy, they're incompetent, there are too many of them, and you know, they're very unproductive, would be fired in a heartbeat by the corporate board of directors. No one would tell a CEO that's how to get productivity out of your workforce. So if you really want to run it like a company, how about start with management principles of the people who work for you? And what they've done, now if you don't believe in government, then it makes sense. Because why would I want to encourage anyone to go in it? Why would I want to make it more efficient? Why would I actually want it to be more attractive? Why would I want more people to depend on it? The more dysfunctional I can make it, the better off all of us will be. And that seems to be the game plan for some people, at terrible cost. And the final point, I worry about the next generation. How do you go on a college campus as a federal government recruiter and say, I see a 30-year career in federal service for you? And 47% of our current workforce is eligible for retirement this decade. The baby boom generation is retiring. Not me. But how are we going to recruit and replace them? How are we going to attract the higher end skill set we're going to need for the workforce in the future? And there are real consequences, unfortunately, for the rhetoric and for the behavior and for the constant hitting up of the federal employee for things that they can't possibly be responsible for. To this day, the only group in America that's been asked to contribute directly out of their pocket to the federal debt are federal employees, to the tune of at least $138 billion. At one point, some of my friends on the other side of the aisle wanted to actually reduce federal pensions to fund transit. Now, all of us probably support transit. But what is the nexus between federal pensions and transit? We were able to kill that. But I mean, that's how far it goes. And it's sort of an invidious logic that we've just got to get out of. There's a group of us, a critical mass, I hope, who are willing to fight for that and make that appeal. Part of it is education. We've got a lot of new members who came in 2010 who have no idea about federal service and federal employees, aren't even aware of the federal footprint in their own respective districts. That gives us an opportunity for education, and I hope we will use it. Now, Sharon mentioned I represent the largest number of federal foreign service officers active and retired in the United States. I'm very proud of that statistic. We need to get that kind of data for every congressional district if we don't already have it, and for active and retired federal employees as well. It's a little harder than you might think, actually, to get that broader data. But it will come as a surprise to some of my colleagues how big the footprint is in their respective districts. 85% of all federal employees are outside the Beltway. Well, that means they work somewhere. And it's probably in Wyoming and Montana and places like that that might surprise some of my colleagues.
And a follow on to that to some extent, obviously 2014 was a very busy year in foreign affairs, a lot of attention to things happening overseas, and in all of the hot spots and humanitarian crises, we know that our membership, the Foreign Service, was right there on the front lines doing that work. And with the American public, we find that there's not as much of a familiarity with the work of the Foreign Service as there is our brothers and sisters who are in the military. And I just wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts on what's the best way. You talked a little bit about education. How do we let people know what we're doing?
Well, I would think actually AFSA probably knows the answer to that better than I do. There are lots of ways of educating people about the mission. You know, relative to other federal footprints, the Foreign Service is relatively small. And so, you know, our influence in communities, that, you know, broadly put, is by definition limited. I would say, you know, trying to find opportunities to talk through various civic networks. You know, Rotaries and Chambers and Kiwanis and Lions, and they're always interested in speakers, especially if you know, it's your community. And I mean, in my community, we go Foreign Service officers and see them all the time. But it might be a big deal if you're in, you know, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and that's your hometown, and you're back visiting, and you ask to speak at the Rotary or whatever. Those things do matter in the education of the population, especially that human contact, because now it's not some bloated, remote bureaucracy. It's Matt. You know, he grew up here. I know his parents, and it's fascinating to hear what he's doing for his country. And so I wouldn't miss those opportunities, as well as, you know, the wonderful work you already do. As active Foreign Service officers and as retirees, you can really make a difference. That person-to-person contact can really make a difference. And I might add, it can also make a difference in the education of Congress. Because if they're suddenly hearing from their constituents, you know, we had this incredible speaker, and he or she was telling us all about what it was like in the Civil War, or, you know, bringing peace to Colombia, or whatever it might be. It's going to make me feel a little, first of all, gee, someone had an impact. And secondly, it may not be as black and white as I thought it was. These people seem to be doing some pretty good stuff, and maybe that starts to shade me with a little more gray in things I say and do.
Well, and that's something that we've talked a little bit about here too, because anyone who's worked in an embassy is familiar with the CODELs, or congressional delegations coming overseas, but we know that that's not happening as much as it used to. And so I think it's more of a challenge even to educate your colleagues in Congress about that.
I'm glad you brought up CODELs.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, as have many of you. And I wish it was only good, and I wish all members took the attitude that when they travel, it is truly to be educated. It isn't anything else. Human nature being what it is, we sometimes have to put up with other things than beyond education. But let me just say, on balance, we want more CODELs, not fewer. We want, listen, there's nothing more transformative than being exposed to the fact that there is a whole other point of view in looking at reality. There's a whole other cultural expression about religion, about belief systems, about political democratic expressions, about politics, about how society is organized. And it's so eye-opening. And it helps you appreciate the complexity of the world we live in, and therefore how we need to be more supple and subtle in our dealings with others. Maybe more inclusive, maybe more accepting. You know, American exceptionalism is fine, but there are lots of other people who believe they're pretty exceptional too. And maybe we need to better appreciate that. The best way to do that is to see that world firsthand, to be exposed. And unfortunately, we may have to put up with some of the bad, but I do think the choice is Would you rather have a Congress that is exposed to the world, or a Congress that honestly is just mired in its own parochialism and takes pride in saying, I got a passport that's never been stamped? What could go wrong with that?
So just quickly then, before we open up the floor to questions, would you say that is it a budget issue, or is it just a lack of desire to travel?
Speaker Boehner canceled a lot of MilCon flights. Now, if I'm going to Europe, I'm going to fly commercial, of course. But if I'm going to the Middle East, I don't want to fly commercial. And if I have to, it now raises the question of whether I really want to do that. And there are members who love to travel and travel a lot. Most of us have to factor it in, even me. And my district, as Sharon pointed out, not only do I represent a lot of foreign service officers, I have huge diversity in my district, lots of ethnic groups, big ones. And they like the fact that they're members on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Now, that's not true for everybody, right? It's a liability for a lot of members. So travel has to be calculated and sort of meted out in very careful measures. So it doesn't hurt you back home. And if you make it more difficult and more complicated, now how I weigh whether I'm going to say yes or no to that Cordell is deeply affected. And so I think it was a bad judgment call on Speaker Boehner's part. I think a lot of Republicans agree with that. And it has put another barrier up to travel, to seeing the world. And I just think that's very unfortunate.